So I'm going to tell you two stories. And as Stefania said, the South is in the North in this case. And then the post-colonial is actually in the North in this case. And the post-colonial databases in this case, one will be a post-colonial context in the context of Ireland and the database translations of the place names database. And the other post-colonial story is the story of placing names on the map, and that's the place names work being done at the Geomatics and Cartographic Research Center, primarily with Inuit in the North. And so both those cases, ding-a-ling-a-ling, out. So in both those cases, I feel like I'm mean like that with my children too. So in the context of storytelling, place names, which a lot of people don't realize, most nation states have a place name database. If you have a state, you have a database of place names. They're the fundamental underlying infrastructure or of storytelling, of situating you in your place, of reminding you of things. It's a kind of institutional memory when it's the database and it's the place names board, but it's also these names of places as you're walking through space that either tie you to that place, or in the context of Ireland and in the context of North America, ties us back to England, and in some cases back to France, and a few other cases back to Germany and or to Sweden, depending on the place names and where people settled at different places. So it ties you to another kind of colonial type of context. But they're also a kind of infrastructural script. And when it's in a database, they are data infrastructure, they're a kind of visualization, but they're also a kind of regulatory system that the state very closely governs, because you have these things called place name boards that guard the naming of places, and it's very difficult to change the name of places when you have these boards. And they also guard the new names that come in to make sure that places aren't repeated, or that they fit in, or that you're not going to send your paramedics to the same street twice in two different locations, right? So it's a technical process, but it's also a cultural process. It's also a statehood kind of management project. It's also sometimes demonstrating and mapping on the terrain old stories from other places that are leaving their traces behind and their memories behind. And also, when you live in a place where the place names change all the time, generally, that's a place with quite a bit of turbulence, because that means new powers are coming in, changing things. A new power comes in, new dictatorship comes in, there's new changes of names, or in the context of China, where there's so much construction, there's all kinds of new names and new numbers of places coming in on an ongoing basis. So there's change and there's turbulence, and it's mapped on the terrain, and it's mapped in the databases. In the context of Ireland, what's very interesting is it's the place, and this is the Republic, but the entire island as well, it's the first place in the world to have a scientific survey. And once the British conducted their scientific survey in Ireland, they copie conforme, they brought this practice to India, they brought this place to Australia, they brought it to New Zealand, they brought it to Canada, they brought it to many island nation states, the scientific survey. But the first experiment of the first survey was actually conducted in Ireland. And along with that survey came renaming Ireland and renaming places. And it's a very officious record-keeping kind of process. The difficulty at the time was the British couldn't pronounce the Gaelic names. They were like, oh, these savages, these illiterate people, we're not going to be able to repeat these names. We don't understand what they mean. So we're just going to anglicize them, and we're going to write them down phonetically, or we're just going to replace them with a completely other name, which is exactly what happened in the context of Ireland. And these old names were placed into something called the names books. And when you go into the archives of the Ordnance Survey, you can find some of these books. This is a relatively new one. But you can find these old bundles of maps and of place names that are actually being scanned at the moment and being translated into new kinds of databases and being transcribed. So you see again this apparatus of survey, of place names, of this colonial scientific assemblage being imposed in many other places and often erasing what pre-existed before. Fast forward from the 1600s, and I mean, you might have noticed William Petty's name. So for any of you who look at the history of statistics, William Petty was also a very important actor in the history of statistics, in the history of algorithms, in the history of prediction, and in the history of correlation analysis and those types of things as well. So you start seeing here, 175 years later, we have this gentleman called John O'Donovan who starts transcribing the old names. And he's transcribing the old names with some etymology, trying to look for the history of these places, because the story, the history, the ideas, and the memories are captured in the actual old Gaelic names. So he started to transcribe these and to start keeping a glossary of these, which were digitized and translated into an actual database, which I'll get to in a second. But the reason I got to this point of translations was because of Brian Friel's book, actually called Translations. He's a very important playwright that died, I think, about 3 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. Very, very important playwright in the context of Ireland. And he wrote precisely about this moment in this play of the interplay between the Ordnance Survey coming and the Ordnance Survey changing the names, and the reaction of people on the ground to the changing of those names, and how they were so concerned that they were going to forget who they were and they were going to forget where they lived, but they had to pretend to know the new names, because if they knew the new names, they would not be under trouble or be arrested or make mistakes under the British regime. And so the story is really quite fascinating of this type of, this moment, of this colonizing moment of erasing one place, trying to embody the old place, but recognizing that you have to emulate the new place to stay out of trouble. And it's very well done in this play, which I have yet to see because I haven't seen it performed yet. Now, there was a post-colonial reclaiming in the context of Ireland of these place names. Some major institutions resisted them, but after the uprising of 1916, there was actually an official and independent authority that came into place and said, we are going to reclaim these Gaelic names, and we're going to reclaim these places. And they created what they call the Toponymic Committee, and many states have toponymic committees, and it's their job to keep these lists and these big databases and to guard them with place names boards. And then they started by the late 60s to actually have an official database, an official record of the bilingual place names, Gaelic place names and English place names, in the context of Ireland. And then by 1983, the Ordnance Survey had a policy where all maps were now to be bilingual. They were to be in both Gaelic and they were to also be in English. And so suddenly we start having these post-colonial authorities of actors who are taking the apparatus or the assemblage, if you will, of naming and mapping and survey, but all of the actors in these institutions now are now Irish citizens in their own nation state, and with great pride and great diligence are mapping and creating these place name branches and operating these place name branches with great pride because Gaelic is coming back. But in addition to that translation, getting the names back into Gaelic, there's a translation into a linked database. And the linked database is also a very interesting post-colonial activity, because not only were the names lost when the British Empire came, history was wiped because the records were wiped of everything. And the records that were kept were only the historical records of the British. And so there had to be this kind of reclaiming of archaeological information, the reclaiming of old letters, the reclaiming of historical artifacts, and trying to connect them to places. And thus, this linked database that's actually now being used for mapping. And you can go to the place names database that's bilingual. You can look at the linked data set. You can start looking at maps of these particular databases. But you also now are able to bring them into DPpedia and augment space. So suddenly, the place names are in the infrastructure of the web in the context of Ireland, in the Gaelic place names and the English place names. And they're being interconnected with all kinds of other digital records. Which means that we're starting to now be able to re-narrate the story of Ireland that was not able to be narrated before because the records weren't linked or they weren't available or they weren't transcribed. There's a national database of national biographies, and the national biographies, of course, are this digital humanities exercise of transcribing these texts, and the old Gaelic place names are now being linked to this particular database. So now you can start finding the biographies and the stories of these people because these things are linked. And there's also an old terminology database that's now that's also being connected in with these Gaelic types of databases. So again, augmenting the story of Ireland in a way that it hadn't been augmented before. And it's now also being tied, the place names, the Gaelic place names database is also being tied into a folklore collection database of the old stories that are being collected by ethnographers and anthropologists to try and reclaim what is being left in the memories of many of the elders who can still recall some of the old stories and the old stories of the places. In addition to audio recordings, because not everybody can speak Gaelic, not everybody can speak Irish Gaelic, and I don't know about you, I have a hard time with these long German names, but if you see the spelling of Gaelic names, they're really complicated. I can't read them. And so even for people who are in Ireland, they need to hear them. They need to sound them out. And so the fact that there's an audio recording of these place names means that people can relearn the names, they can relearn the places, and they can relearn the pronunciation of these places and make sure to keep the language. In addition to that, the census is now a linked database in the context of Ireland. So you can now link contemporary census place names, old place names, and augment it again with all of this other historical information because the census data goes back a couple of hundred years in the context of Ireland as well, which means these are also now linked and the new stories are emerging. And of course, the Ordnance Survey, which was the colonial survey, is now one of the top ordnance surveys in the world and the most technologically savvy and enabled ordnance surveys in the world that actually is now linking their entire survey database with the place names database and all of these other things. So suddenly you have a colonial context of loss, regaining of the old stories, but then augmenting those stories in the context of translating them digitally into new databases and interconnecting them. When we go into the context of Canada, which is a completely other north and a completely other place, similar colonial history, but played out very, very differently with very, very different people, we had places that have no names on the map because the names on the map are in the minds of the elders because it's primarily an oral culture. But if there's no name on the map, that's the best place for mineral and mining exploitation. Particularly in the context where the north is melting. And the north is melting and the permafrost is melting and the ice is melting and the water is rising and shipping lanes are opening. And you'll see a map later of the Circumpolar North, which means at the moment the north is the new south because the north is the new El Dorado for exploitation. Because we haven't been able to exploit the north, the Circumpolar North, in the way we could before because it was at least protected by ice. But now that that's disappearing, we're getting another story. In the context of the Geomatics and Cartographic Research Center and the work that we were doing in that lab, we were working with Inuit and First Nations, and to a lesser extent with Métis, to go into the old records and grab any kind of information from expeditions, from ethnographers, from people who are going there, and then taking that information and going back to talk to people who still have the memory of those treaties or who remember hearing something from their great-grandparents about those treaties. And so we're tying their oral stories and their oral histories with the making of that territory and the construction of that territory with the early expeditions and the creation of those treaty processes. So what it's doing is it's blurring and making messy the boundaries and the treaty lines that were created that look so tidy and clean on a map, but they were incredibly messy colonial types of projects. And these are just examples of, you can go to the map, you can take a look at the expeditions, you can take a look at the locations, you can see some text related from the old text or from the surveyor's notebooks. You can get access to the treaty process and the news stories that come in with these places, photographs of what it might have looked like when the explorers were there. But it's not the only records that we have of North America, because we have the Thule expedition in the 1920s that also came to Canada, and we've now what we call Geo Transcribe that database with the place names that they had, but also the stories and the histories of the people that they encountered in these places in the north. And so you could go and click on the map, and it'll take you straight to the text, it'll take you straight to the page, it'll take you straight to the story, and then we augment that story with the story of elders who live in those particular locations. But those are not the only stories that are being told, because the new story, as I already alluded to, is the melting ice. And so part of the work that we were doing was to work with Inuit on to-dos, mapping. These are all where the ice used to be. The ice now is way back there. So there's no longer, this area no longer freezes. Now Inuit are very interesting because Inuit have place names for places that appear and disappear because they live on the ice 70% of the year. But now that the ice is melting, you can't live in those places anymore. And what it's also doing is it means you have to travel much longer distances without fuel or without the old historical maps that people have embodied in their minds in terms of navigation and wayfinding in the north. And for many of you, it's hard to imagine, but just imagine a perfectly white place. It's minus 40 below. The sky is overcast. There is no such thing as GPS. There's none of that. And there are no landmarks because it's flat, and you're traveling hundreds of kilometers at night with your family. That's how dangerous that terrain is. And the fact that they've used these old routes for centuries is actually really quite astonishing. So some of this work here, each of these lines is a line that was collected by an elder. We can trace back the metadata of each of one of these lines, but what these lines have been doing is it's been helping Western empirical scientists reconfirming and reaffirming what they have been suspecting, but didn't have the granularity of the detail of what the effects were of the ice melting in the north. So suddenly we're bringing traditional knowledge and Western knowledge together. We started looking at the naming of places and the naming of things and starting developing brand new ontologies, developed in collaboration with Inuit and led by Inuit, and doing this kind of work of who's traveling where, what they're up to, how did they capture these lines. But also doing ethnographic work with elders, getting them to tell their story, record their stories, go on the map, access those stories on the map, and so on, and also providing all of these records of photographs, of stories, of video, of audio, of any kind of material that we might have, because these people are dying and we will not have access to these stories because it's completely an oral story. It is not a transcribed story. This is another story of the Gwich'in people and the transcription, some of the work that we were doing with the collecting of those information. So both these stories, in a way, the Irish story with place names and the local and traditional knowledge stories in terms of putting places on the map in order to preserve those places, are kind of collective memory projects in these places, and most certainly both of them collective memory practices in very much a post-colonial context, but also of reclaiming these places, and most particularly for Inuit, a reclamation and a positioning themselves and actually using the empirical tool in their favor. The greatest difficulty that we've had in this particular context is we can't map everything. So the places that will not be mapped will be the places that will be there for mineral and mining exploitation, and this is tricky. But as we were doing this work, we also had to reconsider the entire underlying infrastructure because we had to allow emerging conceptual ontologies to happen. We could not create categories ahead of time because we didn't know the categories. And we only figured this out by making an atlas, by forcing categories, and we were told by the elders, well, we don't know what you're talking about, so we're not going to work with you, so you're going to have to change something. So suddenly we had to completely change our back end of our entire infrastructure to allow classifications and things to emerge in terms of the coding and of the place names and of the crowdsourcing. This is all open source tools. You can go get access to all this other stuff. But then there had to be an ownership component of these data because people want access and ownership of their data and they want to manage them, but there is no there's no bandwidth in the north, and there was very little capacity in the north. So we had to create a local area network for information that could not be shared broadly on the web. Sacred sites, for instance, bear dens, hunting sites, those kinds of places could not be shared. And those stayed up in the north. But what we also had to ensure is that we could synchronize all of these data in the south when bandwidth is slow at night so that there's at least a backup of these data and they are managed. So these data are now co-managed with Inuit in the north. And we have all of these new servers that have gone up in the north. So you can imagine how this stuff travels because there's no fiber optic cables up here at the moment. There are fiber optic cables planned, but there aren't any at the moment. And so this was not only a place naming activity, but it was an entire infrastructural practice and an entire infrastructural project. In addition to that, we had to come up with ways of respecting what the elders understand of the sharing of their local and traditional knowledge, and we had to start developing legal regimes to protect those data and to protect those artifacts. And I won't go through the details, you can go take a look at it. But we came up with something similar to Creative Commons that looked at simple questions of, I don't want my knowledge to be used by mining companies, or I would like to retain control over how my knowledge is used, and I don't want commercial hunters to have access to my data. So how do you create a license with that in mind and those kinds of constructs in mind? And so what we looked at also was issues of use-based consent and reciprocity, and if you're not nice with my data, I get to take my data back. That was actually a component in these licenses. So we mapped that out with a legal team called the Canadian Internet Public Policy Interest Clinic to try and preserve these data. A final note on these ones in terms of governance, this is a different First Nations group, but it was mentioned yesterday, so I wanted to bring it up today, is the First Nations Information Governance. And for those of you who were in Ottawa in 2017, you would have heard Gwen Phillips's talk, and if you haven't heard it, go take a look at it on YouTube. It's a fantastic talk. But it's this idea of ownership, control, access, and possession of data, and it's an entire framework on the reclamation and the sovereignty over knowledge about people, and the production of data about people, and not only who gets to own them, who gets to use them, and who gets to possess them, but how do you define us? You don't get to define us in the old ways that you defined us. You have to define us in a new way. So in both these cases, it's a kind of translation. It's a translation that's continuously ongoing because things are always changing. In one, it's the land and the people dynamically change, and it's the survey, and it's from Gaelic into English, and then from English back into Gaelic, and then from Gaelic back into a database, and then from a database to a map, and then a map into a linked database that gets augmented. And in the context of local and traditional knowledge, it's transmitted orally, it's translated into a new media, it's translated into a new format, it's put onto a map, and it's used to protect those people and those areas. And they are now recreating new forms of post-colonial memory systems according to the experiences, desires, aspirations, and dreams and fears of these people in these different places in very, very different types of contexts. So the interconnections increase. These database translations kind of technologically intermediate these histories, these places, these locales, these histories, and also in both contexts push us to be much more reflexive and concerned about how we construct things from the infrastructural level, from the data level, from the classificatory level, for the ownership level, and for the possession and so on level. And finally, what is going to happen? This map is the circumpolar map. If you take a look how close we are, look how close Canada is here. Look at Sweden, Finland, etc. Look at Russia here in the circumpolar north. This is the new area here, this passageway here. The Northwest Passage is the new passageway that's just opened. It's now melting. The ships are able to navigate here. People are mapping the north like crazy, as they did in the early colonial days. Flags are going up all over the place. People are marking their 200-kilometer territories because it's fishing, it's oil, it's whatever. But this map of nation states misses this map of all the indigenous groups that were sent to the margins in the north. So how do we start ensuring that we don't have another wave of colonialism to a people who have already been colonized. And we've already seen with the spatial data infrastructure in the north some work being done to take the work that we did in Nunavut and to translate into these particular contexts. So I'm hoping that the future here is brighter and there will be a lot more influence by indigenous groups in these particular areas. And there are opportunities to do so, and they are actually emerging. So thank you very much for listening to the stories of mine. Yeah.
Thank you very much to our two speakers, if you want to come over here, Tracey and Monika, for taking us on two fascinating trips into dispossession, sadly, but also forms of resistance in various ways, or forms of critique, at least. So the floor is yours. We don't have much time, because people at some point have to leave on a tour. That's what... And we also would like to give the floor to Geo, but I already see a person there. Please, if you can just say your name and keep it.
Hi, I'm Monika from Toponymic Committee. Thank you both for everything and enlightening talks. Just because it's the last thing up on the board, Tracey, I would love to ask you what you're seeing emerge as potential coalition building mechanisms or forums for discussion amongst the Indigenous people around the Circumpolar North map, and what you believe the interaction between the data-fied resources and that coalition building would be.
So there's the Circumpolar North associations that exist. They're quite strong. The resistance is scientists in some ways, because scientists are having a hard time dealing with these new ontologies. They're having a hard time trying to figure out how you mix Western empirical mapping science and databases with indigenous notions of those, and of course multiple languages. There's hundreds of languages and dialects going on in here. But they're at the table together. It's being led by pretty progressive states, not all of them, but most of them are really quite progressive, and they fully recognize that this has to be done. Now, it's one thing to be able to map progressively, and it's a whole other thing to be able to create place names databases and to demarcate territories and so on, but it's a whole other thing to push back on mining. Because when you stake a claim, you can stake a claim anywhere you want, because those old laws, those old colonial surveying laws have been around for centuries and they're not off the books. What's been very, very interesting, though, is this entire education process and this work with ITK, which is an Inuit organization that's been dealing with all of the research that goes in the north. So if you go up north, you have to go through them as gatekeepers, because they don't want people to be oversampling people or doing nonsensical work. They want to make sure that there's some control with who goes in the north. But they're also helping all of these other organizations to also ensure that researchers and governments aren't just going in there exploiting, that they actually have to follow the rules. And we're also seeing that influence how these different governments operate. So we'll see. In the context of Canada and its spatial data infrastructure, and Canada's leading a lot of this, they're doing quite good work. But the jury is out with what's going to happen, even if you've got the map. And then, I guess the final point on it is they're trying to also map land use and occupancy. So occupancy is I live here, but I use all of this for hunting, for traveling, for burying, for ceremony. And so how do you map occupancy and how do you map land use? And so the big projects now are pushing indigenous groups in this entire region to map land use, because then you can start staking a claim even if there is no official documentary type of claim.
Okay, so I already conquered the microphone. I want to ask you both, first of all, really thanks for these very inspiring talks. I love them both. I want to ask about, in both cases, the kind of like counter datification or bottom-up datification is oriented on actually memory and kind of like tracing what was, right? So it's kind of like it's going back in time in order to stake claims, of course. And I was wondering, I believe that in both cases, if you look at the Mediterranean Sea in terms of like predictive policing and security, and in terms of maybe the forecasting and like the kind of like interest that is in resources in this area, actually predicting and forecasting must be something that very powerful actors are very interested in. So I was wondering, in your both cases, I don't know whether you both have an idea about this, can we just leave forecasting to those powerful actors and we do the work of memory, or is there also a way in which you can actually do this critical work? And everything that I've heard, like from the families on Facebook to what you have been talking about, it's all already amazing. But I'm just wondering whether forecasting can also be disrupted somehow and can also be claimed.
No, I think that was precisely my critique. So my critique of the activist map is that they are not only fetishizing space once again, spatializing death, rather than starting to work with the insubstantial materiality of death. And start to reclaim the voice of the migrant subject from this position of immateriality. That's what I mean by this scattered presence. And here the predictive element becomes crucially important. I reference it because it's one actual example that I found in one of the forensic journals. The scientists are actually experimenting with these methods. They're just not put into practice by activists yet. And understandably so. It takes quite some. But then again, forensic oceanography, they have gone to such lengths doing actually data forensics to expose NATO responsibilities that were not taken up. But their focus on critiquing the state completely lost sight of the actual purpose of their work, which is the migrant body. So I think very much so. It's precisely the relationality, and to think the migrant subject not as the bounded essence, but in its futurity, in its afterlife, in the lives of children, of wives, of future trajectories of those who survive. That for me is the critical site for activism in regards to data collection.
Prediction is a different game here, because for local and traditional knowledge, you're predicting that you're going to be exploited. You know you're going to be exploited. You know that it's coming. So everybody's, for lack of a better way of saying, is hustling to ensure the prevention of exploitation. But then there's these massive, I think for us here as social scientists, we forget that where the really big AI stuff is happening is in geophysics, it's in geomatics, it's in weather prediction, and they're good at it. They've been doing it for a very, very long time. And their prediction models is to exploit. Where are they going to drill? Where are they going to dig? Where's the possibility of this, and this combination of minerals or whatever features that are going to lead me to find oil or something else? So we're not going, the genie is out of the lamp on that one. That is not going back. The trick is to be able to create other contexts on the terrain to protect people or to give them rights to that. So if you're going to be doing any mineral and mining exploration on my land, then I have to be part of that equation. There has to be social and environmental and economic impact assessments, all of those other things. And I think that's something that we forget with this algorithmic work. The powerful algorithmic work is really in the geomatics world. It's one anyway.
But
Yeah.
can you not use prediction to expose the violence that is to come should exploitation and mining be given its way?
You could, but people are too busy just surviving. They don't, yeah. I understand, but we can't. It's,
One very
yeah.
last question, please. All of you keep it very short.
Yes.
I try very much. To be very short, how do you think, what can unite those people who try to bring back the names of old places in Ireland, or if you speak about the Siberian territories, do something there too? I mean, what I have understood that the movement towards recolonizing is very strong, and you have just explained how it works with capital, with industry, and so on. But what can unite and bring together those who are counter-movement, from your point of view? I mean, if not just their own histories that are very diverse and very separated from each other.
So the Circumpolar Committee is that, precisely. So there are circumpolar committees of indigenous peoples that are funded by their nation states and or the United Nations and or other organizations that actually are doing that unification work. The issue is you can do that circumpolar work, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your state is going to recognize that work and is going to recognize the outcome. So there are very, very strong coalitions in the north doing the data work, that are understanding the exploitation work, but it's a lot more work to come. Yeah.
Thank you so much to both of you and to the audience as well. And now we have to, without even uploading now.